At 0900 on February 19, 1945, Corporal Tony Stein crouched behind a shallow depression in the black volcanic sand of Iwo Jima while holding a weapon that his sergeant had called a foolish idea 3 months earlier. He was 23 years old with 6 combat missions and no conventional kills. The Japanese had fortified every meter of this 8-square-mile island with 11 miles of interconnected tunnels and 17,000 defenders. Their overlapping fields of fire had turned the beach into a deadly zone. Stein was among the first Marines from Company A 1st Battalion 28th Marines to secure a position beyond the landing area. Around him Marines were pinned down by intense machine gun and mortar fire coming from hidden pillboxes that were carefully camouflaged and almost impossible to see. By mid-morning the 5th Marine Division had already lost 43 men. Dead Marines were scattered across the terrace beach and their bodies lay twisted in the volcanic ash. The standard Browning M1919 machine gun was effective, but it weighed 31 pounds without ammunition and fired 400 rounds per minute. It worked well for defense, but it was poorly suited for fast-moving assaults. Stein had recognized this problem months earlier. Back in November 1944 at Camp Tarawa in Hawaii, he had observed machine gun crews struggling during training exercises. The gunners could not keep pace with advancing rifle platoons. They would set up the weapon, fire a burst, then spend several minutes dismantling the equipment before moving forward again. By that time the momentum of the attack had already faded. Tony Stein was a trained toolmaker. He had been born in Dayton, Ohio, to Austrian Jewish immigrants who had escaped anti-Semitism in Eastern Europe. During his teenage years he worked with a lathe at Patterson Field and later became a tool and die maker at Dello Products. Because of this background he understood machinery and its limitations. When he joined the Para Marines in September 1942, that mechanical knowledge followed him into combat. During the fighting on Bougainville he eliminated 5 Japanese snipers in a single day. However, his ability to modify equipment attracted the attention of Sergeant Mel Grevich. Grevich had been experimenting with an unusual idea during the Bougainville campaign in 1943. He had recovered an AN-M2 aircraft machine gun from a crashed Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bomber. The AN-M2 had been designed for aircraft combat. It weighed only 21 pounds, which was 10 pounds lighter than the M1919. More importantly, it could fire between 1,200 and 1,500 rounds per minute, which was about 3 times faster. The problem was that the AN-M2 used spade grips meant for aircraft mounts. It had no stock and no sights, and there was no practical way for a single Marine to carry it and fire accurately while moving forward. When Grevich approached Stein in November 1944, the Para-Marine units had just been disbanded. Both men had been reassigned to the 28th Marines of the 5th Marine Division. They were preparing for a coming operation, although the leadership had not yet revealed its name. Everyone understood that the mission would be extremely difficult. Grevich showed Stein the AN-M2 and Stein immediately saw its potential. They worked quietly at night inside a maintenance shed. Stein shortened an M1 Garand buttstock and hollowed it so it could fit the machine gun buffer tube. He built a solenoid trigger system using small pieces of sheet metal. Grevich attached a Browning automatic rifle bipod to the front of the weapon. They also added rear sights taken from a bar for aiming. The finished weapon was rough in appearance and weighed about 25 pounds. It used a 100-round ammunition box and could empty that box in roughly 5 seconds of continuous fire. They named the weapon the Stinger. Stein produced 6 of them. One was issued to each of Company G rifle platoons. One went to the demolition section. One was kept by Grevich and the last one by Stein himself. The reaction among other Marines was divided. Some believed the idea was brilliant while others thought it was extremely dangerous. One sergeant predicted the weapon would jam during the first burst. Another warned that the thin barrel would overheat after 2 magazines. A platoon commander from the 2nd Battalion commented that only a foolish man would bring an aircraft gun into an infantry battle. Yet when Stein tested the weapon on the firing range and emptied an entire ammunition box into a target 200 yards away in less than 6 seconds, the criticism quickly faded. Company commanders approved the weapon and the battalion leadership also gave permission. The Stinger was going into combat. Now on the beach at Iwo Jima, Stein tightened his hold on the weapon. The barrel of the Stinger was already warm. Around him Marines were being killed because they could not identify the hidden Japanese positions. The normal procedure was to call for tank support or naval artillery, but the tanks were stuck in the soft volcanic sand and naval shells could not strike targets that remained unseen. Stein made a decision. If you want to see how Stein plane gun performed during the battle, please press the like button because it helps share more forgotten stories from the Pacific. Subscribe if you have not already. Returning to the story, Stein stood fully upright in the center of a beach where Japanese machine gunners had overlapping fields of fire. Corporal Tony Stein exposed himself in order to draw enemy attention. He needed the defenders to reveal their firing positions. He needed to see the muzzle flashes. Bullets passed close to his head and mortar shells exploded in the volcanic ash nearby. Then Stein noticed it. A pillbox about 75 yards to the northwest concealed by volcanic rock and sand. The barrel of a Type 92 heavy machine gun extended slightly from the opening. Stein lowered the Stinger, aimed carefully and pressed the solenoid trigger. The weapon fired with tremendous speed at more than 1,200 rounds per minute. The pillbox began to break apart under the force of the .30 caliber rounds. Bullets struck the volcanic rock and sandbags with relentless impact. The Type 92 machine gun suddenly fell silent. Through the dust, Stein noticed movement inside the position, and then everything stopped. He shifted his aim to another pillbox located 40 yards to the left. He fired another burst lasting several seconds. The concrete structure absorbed some of the rounds, but the intense volume of fire was overwhelming. The Japanese machine gun crew inside ceased firing. Around Stein, the Marines started moving forward again. Once the enemy position was suppressed, riflemen advanced from their shallow positions in the sand while sergeants shouted commands. The attack regained momentum. Stein rushed toward the first pillbox. Because the Stinger was lighter than the M1919, he was able to run with it. He reached the position quickly. Inside, 3 Japanese soldiers were already dead. The rapid rate of fire had cut through everything inside. He moved to the second pillbox and found the same outcome. 2 enemy soldiers were down and the position had been neutralized. However, Stein suddenly felt the weapon become lighter in his hands. The ammunition box was empty. 100 rounds had been fired in less than 10 seconds of actual trigger use. He had expected this issue during training in Hawaii, but facing it during real combat felt very different. The Stinger was extremely powerful, yet it consumed ammunition at an incredible speed. Stein looked back toward the beach about 200 yards away. The ammunition resupply point was near the waterline where landing craft were still unloading supplies while occasional mortar rounds continued to fall. To obtain more linked .30 caliber ammunition, he would need to cross open ground with no cover. He immediately began running. The deep volcanic sand made every step slow and exhausting. It was not like ordinary sand. The volcanic ash was loose and uneven, and it shifted under every step. Marines often described it as running through ball bearings. Stein boots sank several inches with each stride. As he moved halfway toward the beach, he passed a wounded Marine. The man was a private first class from 2nd Platoon with a shrapnel wound in his left leg. He was conscious but unable to walk. Stein lifted him and placed him over his shoulder and continued moving forward. The Marine weighed about 160 pounds. The Stinger weighed 25 pounds. Stein combat pack added another 30 pounds. In total, he was carrying more than 215 pounds while moving through volcanic ash as Japanese mortars targeted the beach area. He reached the supply point at 0945. A corpsman took the wounded Marine from him. Stein quickly collected 4 ammunition boxes, and each box held 100 rounds of linked .30 caliber ammunition. He placed 2 boxes inside his pack and carried one in each hand. Then he turned back toward his platoon position. The return journey lasted about 3 minutes. Japanese snipers had begun targeting Marines who were moving between the shoreline and the forward lines. Bullets struck the black ash near Stein boots as he moved. A mortar round exploded about 30 yards to his right and volcanic rocks and fragments scattered through the air. Stein continued running without stopping. When he returned to Company A position, his platoon sergeant pointed toward another pillbox. This one was larger and built from reinforced concrete. A Type 96 light machine gun inside it controlled the path toward the airfield. 2 earlier assaults against this position had already failed and 4 Marines lay dead in front of the structure. Stein loaded a fresh ammunition box into the Stinger and checked the belt feed carefully. The weapon was already hot from earlier firing, but the thin aircraft barrel could still function. Stein stood up and advanced toward the pillbox by himself. The Type 96 began firing immediately. Bullets passed near his head and chest as he kept moving forward while holding the Stinger at his shoulder. When he reached a distance of 50 yards, he began firing. The weapon rate of fire was extremely high and the Japanese gunner could not adjust his aim quickly enough. Stein round struck the narrow firing slit and the enemy machine gun fell silent. He rushed forward across the final 20 yards and dropped a grenade through the opening. The explosion eliminated the 3-man crew inside the position. Stein then turned away to reload his weapon. The ammunition box was empty once again. He had been fighting for 46 minutes and had already used 300 rounds. The Stinger had proven its effectiveness, but the supply problem was now obvious. The weapon could suppress and destroy enemy positions faster than any standard machine gun, but it demanded constant ammunition. Stein began his second run toward the beach. On the way he discovered 2 wounded Marines. One soldier had a severe chest wound while the other had lost part of his right hand from shrapnel. Stein could not carry both men at the same time. He lifted the Marine with the chest wound first and carried him to the corpsman. After delivering him, he collected more ammunition and then made another trip specifically to bring back the second wounded Marine. By 10:30 Stein had already completed 4 trips between the beach and the front line. Each trip included carrying a wounded Marine to safety. Each time he returned with ammunition for the Stinger. During this period his platoon advanced about 200 yards inland and destroyed 7 enemy positions. Stein alone had eliminated at least 15 Japanese soldiers. However, the Stinger was beginning to show signs of strain. The barrel color had changed because of heat. The solenoid trigger had begun to stick. At the same time, Stein boots were being destroyed by the volcanic ash and the constant movement across the ground. He looked down at his feet and saw that the soles were almost gone. The leather was cracked and torn and running had become painful. Every step produced sharp pain in the arches of his feet. Stein then made another decision. He removed the laces and kicked off his boots so he could run barefoot on the volcanic ash. The choice appeared unusual, but Stein understood the practical reasoning. Time was critical and his damaged boots were slowing him down. The ash was rough, but it was not extremely hot in shaded areas, and without the boots he could move more quickly. He also removed his helmet. The M1 steel helmet weighed about 2.5 pounds. The weight was small, but together with the boots he was removing nearly 5 pounds of equipment. That difference allowed him to move faster between the beach and his platoon. His 5th run to the beach lasted 2 minutes and 40 seconds. Without boots he gained better traction in the loose volcanic ash. His feet sank into the ground, but without the stiff soles he could feel the surface and adjust his steps more effectively. The experience was painful, yet he continued moving forward. The volcanic ash was rough and sharp and it felt similar to running on broken glass, but it allowed him to move faster. On the way toward the beach, Stein found another wounded Marine who had shrapnel in his abdomen. The soldier was unconscious. Stein lifted him onto his shoulder, then carried him to the corpsman. After handing him over, he collected more ammunition and ran back toward Company A position. By 1100 hours Stein had already completed 6 trips to the beach. During those runs he carried 6 wounded Marines to safety. He also delivered 600 rounds of ammunition to the front line and personally destroyed 5 additional enemy positions. His platoon had now moved about 300 yards inland from the shoreline and they were approaching the first airfield. Japanese resistance was increasing steadily. The defenders had built a complex network of pillboxes, spider holes and underground bunkers that were connected through tunnels. When one position was destroyed, soldiers often emerged from another location and continued firing. Within Company A, the Stinger was the only weapon capable of producing enough firepower to suppress several enemy positions at the same time. When Stein fired at a pillbox, the sound of 1,200 rounds per minute alone often caused nearby positions to hesitate. That short pause allowed riflemen to move forward and throw grenades into the openings. However, the weapon was beginning to suffer damage. After continuous firing, the barrel was now visibly glowing. The thin aircraft-grade steel had not been designed for long periods of ground combat. In aircraft it was cooled by high-speed airflow during dive bombing runs. On the ground there was no such airflow and heat quickly built up. The solenoid trigger system also began to weaken. Stein had built it from sheet metal while in Hawaii, and although it functioned, it was not as reliable as a standard factory trigger assembly. At times it would stick and at other moments it would release only a single shot when he intended to fire a burst. Stein often had to strike it with his palm to reset the mechanism. Even with these mechanical problems, the Stinger remained effective. At 11:20, Stein platoon reached a strong Japanese defensive position that had already halted the progress of 2 other companies. The structure was a reinforced concrete bunker with 3 firing openings arranged to control the approach to Airfield No. 1. Several Type 96 light machine guns inside created overlapping fields of fire. 2 tank destroyers had attempted to destroy the bunker earlier, but both vehicles were struck by hidden 47mm anti-tank guns and were forced to withdraw. An airstrike had also been requested, but the bombs landed about 50 yards away and the bunker remained active. Stein examined the position carefully. The firing openings were narrow, about 8 inches wide and 4 inches high, which made them difficult targets. However, the Stinger extremely high rate of fire meant that if he aimed at the opening and held the trigger, some rounds would eventually pass through. Stein advanced toward the bunker by himself. When he reached a distance of 50 yards, he went prone and opened fire. The Stinger emptied its 100-round ammunition box in about 7 seconds. At that distance, at least 30 rounds entered the firing openings. The Japanese machine guns inside immediately stopped firing. Stein quickly reloaded the weapon and rushed forward to the bunker. He dropped grenades through the openings and the explosions eliminated the 5-man crew inside. Company A advance then continued. At 11:50, Stein made his 7th trip toward the beach. This time he carried a Marine who had lost both legs below the knee because of a landmine. The soldier was still conscious and shouting in pain. Stein ran the full 200 yards while the Marine blood soaked into his uniform. The corpsman later stated that if Stein had arrived 30 seconds later, the wounded Marine would have died from loss of blood. During the return trip, Stein encountered something unexpected. Another Marine was carrying a Stinger. The soldier was one of Grevich other gunners from Company G. His weapon had completely jammed after overheating and the barrel had warped. He was bringing it back to the beach in the hope that an armorer could repair it. Stein looked at his own Stinger. The barrel had turned purple from heat. The wooden stock from the Garand was beginning to burn slightly and the bipod had loosened. Even so, the weapon still functioned. Stein made his 8th trip to the beach at 12:30. Once again he carried another wounded Marine and collected more ammunition before returning to the front line. By that time other Marines had begun to notice the barefoot corporal who was making repeated runs across open ground while under fire. Some believed he was reckless while others considered him one of the bravest men on Iwo Jima. Stein himself did not think in terms of bravery. He thought about practical calculations. His platoon required ammunition and wounded soldiers needed evacuation. Without boots he could move faster. The stinger allowed him to suppress enemy positions while moving. Everything else was simply completing the task. However, during his 8th return trip a new problem appeared. A Japanese sniper had taken position overlooking the route between the beach and the forward lines. As Stein ran toward Company A with 4 ammunition boxes, a rifle round passed close to his head. The distance was only a few inches. He immediately dropped flat into the volcanic ash and the stinger landed beside him. For the first time that day Tony Stein was pinned down. The sniper was skilled. Stein could not see the exact position, but the direction of the shot suggested it came from the ridge about 200 yards to the east. The shooter was likely hidden in a spider hole or behind volcanic rock. Japanese snipers were trained to be patient and disciplined, and they often waited many hours for a valuable target. A Marine who repeatedly crossed open ground would certainly be considered important. Stein remained completely still for about 30 seconds and controlled his breathing. The sniper would be observing carefully for any movement. The ground around Stein offered no real cover. The area was flat and exposed between the beach and the forward lines. Another rifle shot passed overhead. The sniper had fired at the place where Stein had been earlier rather than his current position. That meant the shooter had not yet identified his exact location. Stein estimated that he had perhaps 10 seconds before the sniper corrected the aim. He rolled to the left, grabbed the stinger and stood up while running. Instead of moving toward his platoon, he ran toward the sniper position. The reasoning was simple. Moving across the line of sight would make him a more difficult target than running away. If he could reduce the distance, the Stinger high rate of fire would overpower a bolt-action rifle. 3 more shots were fired and all missed. Stein continued sprinting barefoot through the volcanic ash while holding the Stinger and carrying ammunition in his pack. At about 150 yards he noticed movement. A figure was inside a spider hole partly hidden by volcanic rock. Stein dropped to one knee and opened fire. The Stinger began firing rapidly. The stream of rounds struck the rocks and surrounding ground with great force. The sniper position was quickly destroyed. When the ammunition box became empty, there was no further return fire. Stein reloaded the weapon and approached the position with caution. The sniper was dead and a Type 97 rifle lay beside him. Stein removed the telescopic sight from the rifle and continued moving toward Company A. When he reached his platoon at 1,300 hours, the situation had become worse. Company A had been pinned down by a group of fortifications that included at least 8 pillboxes arranged in a semicircle with overlapping fields of fire. Any Marine who stood up was immediately engaged by several positions. During the previous 20 minutes the company had suffered 12 casualties while attempting to advance. The company commander had requested tank support, but the M4 Sherman tanks remained stuck near the beach. The volcanic ash was extremely soft and the vehicles often lost their tracks or became trapped. Artillery assistance was also limited because forward observers could not obtain a clear line of sight toward the enemy positions. Stein moved to the most forward location and studied the battlefield. The 8 pillboxes formed an arc about 100 yards ahead. Japanese soldiers were also moving through trenches that connected these positions. The defense was not static but a coordinated system. The advantage of the Stinger was its high volume of fire. Stein estimated that if he could suppress several positions at once, riflemen would be able to advance under that cover. However, this approach would require him to expose himself again. He stood up and fired at the pillbox on the far left. A 5-second burst released 100 rounds and the position fell silent. He then shifted his aim to the next pillbox and fired another burst. That position also stopped firing. Stein continued working across the arc in sequence while suppressing each location one after another. Japanese soldiers in the trenches began firing at him with Type 99 rifles and Type 96 light machine guns. Bullets struck the ash around his feet and one round hit the Stinger barrel with a sharp metallic sound. The weapon continued firing. Stein emptied the ammunition box, then dropped to the ground to reload. While he prepared another belt, the rifleman of Company A advanced about 50 yards. When Stein stood up and resumed firing, they moved forward another 50 yards. The coordination occurred naturally without spoken commands. The Marines understood that when the Stinger was firing they could advance. By 13:30 Company A had broken through the defensive arc. 5 of the 8 pillboxes had been destroyed while the remaining 3 were abandoned. 17 Japanese soldiers were confirmed dead. Company A had lost 3 additional Marines, but the advance continued. Stein's Stinger was now heavily damaged. The barrel had bent slightly after being struck by a bullet. The bipod had broken completely and the Garand stock had turned black from heat. Despite this damage, the weapon still operated. At 13:45 during the attack on the 6th pillbox, an event occurred that Stein had prepared for during training but hoped would never happen. He was firing a long burst when a Japanese Type 96 machine gun struck the Stinger directly. The impact was powerful. The weapon was torn from Stein's hands and thrown several feet backward into the volcanic ash. Stein quickly moved behind a low ridge of rock for protection. At that moment he had no weapon. The Stinger lay in open ground between his position and an active enemy pillbox, and Japanese soldiers had seen it fall. They understood that he was disarmed and they expected him to attempt to recover the weapon. Stein looked at the Stinger lying in the volcanic ash. The barrel was still smoking and the belt feed system appeared damaged. Even if he recovered it, the weapon might not fire again. Yet he had carried that gun during 8 trips to the beach and used it to destroy more than 15 enemy positions. It had protected his platoon and allowed them to continue advancing. Stein decided to retrieve it despite the risk. He ran into the open ground. The Japanese machine gun began firing immediately and bullets passed near his head and torso. Stein moved in a zigzag pattern so he would be harder to hit. It took only a few seconds to reach the Stinger. He grabbed the weapon and rolled behind another ridge of rock. After checking it, he saw that the belt feed had jammed. A bullet had struck the feed system and bent the guide rails. Stein removed the damaged belt and cleared the obstruction with his fingers. Then he loaded a new ammunition box. The weapon fed correctly. He fired a short burst to test it and the mechanism functioned. Stein stood up and fired the entire ammunition box into the pillbox that had knocked the Stinger from his hands. 100 rounds were fired in about 7 seconds. The position was destroyed and the Type 96 machine gun that had nearly killed him became silent. Stein reloaded the weapon and continued the attack. By 1400 hours, Company A had advanced about 400 yards from the beach. During that time they destroyed 23 enemy positions and Stein was personally responsible for at least 12 of them. His repeated runs to the beach had also saved 9 wounded Marines. The Stinger continued firing even though it had been struck by heat and heavily used. However, the condition of the weapon was now critical. The barrel was visibly bent and the rate of fire had dropped to about 900 rounds per minute. The solenoid trigger now produced bursts of 3 to 5 rounds even when Stein wanted continuous fire. The wooden stock had burned so badly that it was beginning to break apart. At 14:30 during an attack against a fortified trench system, the Stinger was struck again. This time a Type 99 rifle bullet hit the receiver. The impact knocked the weapon from Stein's hands for the second time. It landed about 10 feet away inside a shell crater. Stein was now completely exposed without cover and without a weapon. Japanese soldiers in the trench fired rifles and threw grenades toward him. Stein could see at least 6 enemy soldiers. He ran toward the Stinger while a grenade exploded a few yards behind him. The blast sent volcanic ash and fragments through the air. Pieces of shrapnel struck his left leg and back. The wounds were painful but they did not prevent him from moving. He reached the crater, grabbed the Stinger and dropped inside. The receiver showed a deep mark where the bullet had struck. Stein manually cycled the action and although it felt stiff it still functioned. He loaded a new belt aimed toward the trench and fired. The Stinger continued operating, but the rate of fire had fallen to about 600 rounds per minute, which was roughly half of its original speed. Even so, 600 rounds per minute remained faster than most other weapons on the battlefield. Stein used the Stinger to suppress the trench while riflemen advanced and threw grenades. The position was cleared and 6 Japanese soldiers were killed. Company A continued its advance. By 1500 hours, Stein had completed 8 trips to the beach and back. He had fired more than 2,000 rounds during the battle. On every return trip he had carried wounded Marines away from the front line. His feet were cut and bleeding after running barefoot through volcanic ash. His uniform was soaked with sweat and with the blood of the men he had carried. The Stinger was barely functioning. The barrel was bent slightly and the stock was barely holding together. The solenoid trigger operated unpredictably. Sometimes it fired 1 round, sometimes 5, and sometimes none at all. Stein often had to cycle the action manually between bursts. Despite these problems, Company A had reached its objective. They were now positioned at the base of Mount Suribachi, which was the volcanic peak that dominated the southern end of the island. The mountain rose about 550 feet above sea level. Japanese observers located on the summit could see every American movement on the beach, and artillery spotters directed fire from that height. The mountain had to be captured. At 1700 hours, Stein platoon received orders to establish a defensive perimeter and hold their ground overnight. The attack on Mount Suribachi would begin the next morning. For the moment, Company A needed to consolidate its position, bring supplies forward, and prepare for possible counterattacks. Stein finally had a moment to examine his own condition. His feet were torn and bleeding, and volcanic ash had entered the wounds, which increased the risk of infection. He also had shrapnel fragments in his left calf and lower back. These injuries were minor but still required treatment. His hands were covered with blisters from holding the overheated Stinger, and he was extremely tired. He had been in continuous combat for 8 hours, and during that time he had run nearly 3 miles while carrying wounded men and ammunition under enemy fire and without boots. The damaged Stinger rested beside him inside the fighting position. The weapon was effectively destroyed. The barrel required replacement, the receiver was damaged, the stock was burned, and the trigger mechanism was unreliable. However, it had accomplished its purpose. It allowed Company A to continue advancing at moments when standard weapons might have left them trapped on the beach. Other Marines began referring to Stein as the Barefoot Corporal. Some believed his actions were reckless, while others described him as the bravest man they had ever seen. Stein did not focus on either opinion. He simply completed the task that was necessary. The reasoning had always been straightforward. His platoon required fire support, and the Stinger provided that support. During the night, while Stein attempted to rest inside his fighting position, Japanese infiltrators began approaching the Company A perimeter. Small groups of 2 or 3 soldiers tested the defenses and searched for weak points. Stein lifted the damaged Stinger. Even in its condition, the weapon still offered one advantage, which was a high volume of fire. When a Japanese soldier appeared about 30 yards from his position, Stein fired a burst and the weapon still functioned. The infiltrator was killed. By the morning of February 20, Stein had remained awake for 22 consecutive hours. The attack on Mount Suribachi began at 0800. Company A, together with the rest of the 28th Marines, started climbing the volcanic slopes. The terrain was extremely difficult, with loose ash, little vegetation, and exposed ridges where Japanese observers could watch every movement. The defenders had fortified the mountain with more than 60 pillboxes, bunkers, and cave positions. Each approach was covered by overlapping fields of fire, and Japanese forces had spent months preparing these defenses. Japanese forces had stored large amounts of ammunition, food, and water inside the mountain tunnel system. Their plan was to force American troops to fight for every yard of ground. Stein carried the Stinger with him as the unit moved up the mountain. During the night, an armorer had repaired the weapon and replaced the most damaged parts. The barrel was still slightly bent, but a new belt feed system had been installed and the solenoid trigger worked more reliably. The weapon could still fire, although it was no longer as powerful as it had been earlier in the battle. On February 20 at 0930 Company A encountered a fortified bunker complex halfway up the southern slope. The position included 4 concrete bunkers connected by trenches with several machine gun locations and mortar teams firing from concealed pits. The advance of the 28th Marines slowed as they faced this defense. Stein moved forward carrying the Stinger and identified the main bunker. He began firing at the position. Because of the damaged barrel, the weapon was less accurate, yet at short distance the volume of fire remained effective. The intense fire forced the defenders to pause long enough for demolition teams to move closer with satchel charges. The bunker was destroyed and Company A moved forward another 50 yards. At 1015 Stein's situation changed suddenly. A Japanese grenade landed about 3 feet from his position. He noticed it and attempted to move away, but the grenade exploded before he could escape. Fragments struck his right arm, his right leg and his torso. He suffered several wounds that were not immediately fatal, but he began losing a significant amount of blood. A corpsman reached him within minutes and treated the injuries with bandages while requesting evacuation. Stein refused to leave the battlefield because his platoon was still engaged and the Stinger was still required. For the next 2 hours Stein continued providing fire support even as blood soaked through the bandages. The Stinger continued working despite the heavy damage it had already suffered. Each time a pillbox fired on advancing Marine, Stein suppressed it with bursts of fire. When Japanese soldiers appeared inside the trench network, he targeted them with sustained firing. However, by 12:30 Stein's condition had become worse as the loss of blood increased. He began to feel lightheaded and his vision started to narrow. The corpsman informed him that he required immediate evacuation or he would die on the mountain. This time Stein did not argue. He handed the Stinger to another Marine in his squad and allowed the corpsman to carry him down the slope toward the beach. From there he was placed on a landing craft and transported to a hospital ship anchored offshore. On February 21, while Stein recovered on the hospital ship, the 28th Marines continued their assault on Mount Suribachi. The battle was intense and every cave had to be cleared using flamethrowers and explosives. Each trench required close combat to capture it. Japanese soldiers resisted strongly and most fought until death rather than surrendering. On February 23 at 10:20 in the morning, a patrol from Company E reached the summit of Mount Suribachi and raised a small American flag. Photographer Joe Rosenthal captured the moment. Later the same afternoon, a larger flag replaced the first one and Rosenthal photographed that event as well. The image later became the most recognized photograph of the Pacific War. Stein was not present during the flag raising because he remained on the hospital ship receiving treatment for his injuries. Doctors removed shrapnel fragments from his arm, leg and torso. They treated him for blood loss and the risk of infection. Medical staff informed him that he would likely be transferred to a rear hospital in Hawaii or possibly return to the United States. According to the doctors, his participation in the war had ended. However, on February 25 news reached the hospital ship that affected Stein deeply. The 5th Marine Division had moved north from Suribachi toward the center of the island and was attacking a defensive position identified as Hill 362A. The fighting there was severe and the 28th Marines were suffering extremely heavy casualties. Company A had already lost 30% of its strength in only 2 days. Stein platoon sergeant had been killed and his squad leader had also died. Marines who had trained with him in Hawaii were now dying on a hill in the center of Iwo Jima. On February 26 Tony Stein left the hospital ship despite medical orders that required him to remain there. He climbed down into a landing craft that was returning to the beach. He informed the boat crew that he had received permission to return to duty, although he had not actually been cleared. In reality, he was absent without authorization from the hospital ship, but no one stopped him. He arrived back on the beach at 1400 hours. After landing, he located a supply sergeant and requested a new pair of boots. His feet were still wrapped with bandages, yet he was able to walk. He collected an M1 Garand rifle from a supply area. The Stinger was no longer there and it had either been destroyed or issued to another Marine. For Stein this detail did not matter. His goal was to return to his unit. He moved north across Iwo Jima for about 6 miles through volcanic ash. Along the way he passed destroyed Japanese positions, damaged tanks and scattered equipment. He also passed graves registration teams who were collecting the bodies of American soldiers. Stein finally reached Company A at Hill 362A on February 27. The company had been reduced to 63 men from its original strength of 240. The remaining Marines were extremely tired because they had been fighting for 8 continuous days. They had no rest and no relief, only constant combat against an enemy that refused to surrender. Stein reported to the company commander and he was immediately placed back on the line. Company A required every available rifleman. For the next 2 days Stein fought in intense close combat around Hill 362A. This time he used only an M1 Garand rifle and grenades since the improvised machine gun was gone. The fighting felt different without the Stinger because progress was slower and more deliberate, yet Stein remained effective. On March 1, 1945, Company A received orders to conduct a reconnaissance patrol to locate a group of Japanese pillboxes that had been harassing the regiment advance. The patrol included 19 Marines and Corporal Tony Stein was assigned as assistant patrol leader. Their task was to move forward about 400 yards, locate the enemy positions and return with useful information. The objective was reconnaissance rather than attack. At 0700 on March 1 the patrol left Company A lines. The terrain included volcanic ridges and deep ravines which made the area ideal for ambush. Japanese defenders had established concealed positions throughout the region, including snipers, machine gun nests and mortar teams hidden in caves and spider holes. The patrol advanced carefully. They moved about 20 yards, then stopped to observe and listen. After another 20 yards they paused again. The Marines understood that enemy soldiers were watching them and the only question was when the defenders would open fire. At 0745 the patrol reached a ridge overlooking a small valley. Stein moved toward the front to study the ground ahead more closely. Through the volcanic rock formations he noticed shapes that appeared to be concealed positions, possibly pillboxes or cave entrances. The patrol needed to move closer in order to confirm the observation. Stein signaled the men to continue advancing. He stepped forward while holding his M1 Garand ready. His feet, which were still wrapped from the barefoot runs 8 days earlier, hurt with every step. The shrapnel wounds in his right arm and leg had not fully healed yet. He continued moving forward because the mission required it. At 0752 a single rifle shot was heard. The bullet struck Tony Stein in the head and he collapsed immediately. The shot came from a concealed position about 200 yards to the northeast, likely from a spider hole or cave entrance. The patrol could not see the shooter. A corpsman reached Stein within seconds, but the wound was fatal. Corporal Tony Stein, who was 23 years old, died on the volcanic ash of Iwo Jima at 0753 on March 1, 1945. The patrol returned fire toward the suspected sniper position and Marines called for mortar support. The area was hit with high explosive shells. It was never confirmed whether the sniper died during the bombardment because Japanese soldiers rarely left bodies where American forces could recover them. The patrol completed its mission by identifying the pillbox complex and then returned to Company A with the information. They also carried the body of Tony Stein with them. News of Stein's death spread quickly through the 28th Marines. Many soldiers remembered the barefoot corporal who had made 8 trips to the beach on February 19. They remembered the Marine who refused evacuation even after being wounded. They also remembered the toolmaker from Dayton, Ohio, who had built a weapon from salvaged aircraft parts and used it to destroy numerous enemy positions. On March 2 Stein was buried in the 5th Marine Division Cemetery on Iwo Jima. A simple wooden cross marked his grave and it listed his service number, rank and unit. There was no mention of the Stinger and no mention of the Medal of Honor that would later be awarded in his name. The battle for Iwo Jima continued for another 24 days after his death. The fighting remained severe as the 28th Marines pushed north, clearing caves and fortified positions. American casualties continued to increase. By March 26, when the island was finally declared secure, nearly 7,000 Americans had been killed and about 20,000 were wounded. Japanese losses were even greater. Of the 21,000 defenders, fewer than 1,000 survived. Most died in their positions or took their own lives rather than surrender. The tunnel systems beneath Iwo Jima became mass burial sites. However, on February 19, during the first 8 hours of combat, Tony Stein and his improvised weapon had made a clear impact. His barefoot runs saved 9 wounded Marines who would otherwise have died on the beach. His suppressive fire allowed Company A to advance at moments when other units were unable to move. His mechanical creativity provided the Marine Corps with a weapon that for one day altered the tactical situation. The 5 additional Stinger weapons built by Mel Grevich and John Little also saw combat on Iwo Jima. 2 were destroyed by enemy fire and 1 permanently jammed because of overheating. The remaining 2 survived the battle but were lost later when military equipment was disposed of after the war. None of the original 6 Stingers exist today. They were field modifications and non-standard weapons which the military usually destroys instead of preserving. Even so, the story of the Stinger remained part of Marine Corps history. Armorers and mechanics continued to remember the account of the toolmaker from Ohio who recovered aircraft machine guns and turned them into infantry weapons. Who ran barefoot through volcanic ash so his platoon could stay supplied. Who refused evacuation even after he was wounded. Who returned to the battlefield when he should have been recovering on a hospital ship. In May 1945, Lieutenant Colonel Chandler Johnson submitted a recommendation that Tony Stein receive the Medal of Honor. The recommendation described Stein's actions on February 19. It recorded the 8 trips to the beach. It recorded the wounded Marines he evacuated and the enemy positions he destroyed. It also described the barefoot runs made while enemy fire continued. The recommendation received approval from every officer in the chain of command. Regiment, Division, Fleet, Marine Force and Pacific Command all supported it. Every officer who reviewed the reports reached the same conclusion. Corporal Tony Stein had shown clear bravery and determination while risking his life beyond the normal call of duty. On February 19, 1946, exactly 1 year after Stein's actions on Iwo Jima, his widow Joan received his Medal of Honor during a ceremony at the Ohio State House. Ohio Governor Frank Losh presented the medal. Joan Stein stood in the office holding the decoration while thinking about the memories it carried. Tony's mother Rose attended the ceremony. Tears ran down her face during the presentation. Her son, the child of Jewish immigrants who had left high school to work as a toolmaker, had received the highest military honor in the United States. The Medal of Honor citation explained part of the story. It stated that Corporal Stein was the first man from his unit to reach position after landing during the assault. He carried a personally improvised aircraft-type weapon and used it to deliver fast covering fire while the rest of his platoon tried to move forward. When his fellow Marines were stopped by heavy machine gun and mortar fire, he stood upright and exposed himself to the enemy. By doing this, he drew the hostile fire toward himself and was able to locate the enemy weapons. Determined to eliminate these positions, he charged the enemy pillboxes one by one and killed 20 enemy soldiers during the intense attack. The citation continued with 3 more paragraphs that described each of his 8 trips back to the beach. It also recorded the wounded Marines he carried to safety and his refusal to seek treatment even after he was injured. The document mentioned the personally improvised aircraft-type weapon, though it never used the name Stinger. That name existed mainly in Marine Corps stories and tradition. Tony Stein's remains stayed on Iwo Jima until 1948. In December of that year, his body returned to Dayton for burial with full military honors. The service at Our Lady of the Rosary Church brought hundreds of people together. Veterans' family members and local citizens attended even though many had never met him. They understood what his actions represented. He was buried at Calvary Cemetery in Dayton, and he remains the only Medal of Honor recipient from that city during World War II. His grave marker shows his rank, his unit, and the decoration he earned. Visitors still place coins and small American flags at the site. In 1972, the United States Navy commissioned the USS Stein, which was a Knox-class frigate named in his honor. The ship served for 21 years and operated in both the Pacific Ocean and the Indian Ocean. It was decommissioned in 1993 and later scrapped, but the name Tony Stein continued to exist in naval records. The Marine Corps also preserved his story in training material and historical records. At Paris Island, the recruit depot where new Marines begin service, instructors teach lessons about improvisation and adaptation during combat. Tony Stein's story forms part of that instruction. It tells about the toolmaker who created a weapon from salvaged aircraft parts and about the Marine who ran barefoot across volcanic ash to save fellow Marines. The Stinger itself later became well known in military firearm history. Weapons historian Ian McCullum studied the design and documented its story. The Canadian Historical Arms Museum even built a working replica for educational demonstrations. That replica showed what Stein and Grevich achieved with simple tools and mechanical skill. They had taken an aircraft machine gun built for high-speed airflow and modified it for ground combat. With salvaged parts and practical knowledge, they solved a serious firepower problem faced by the Marines. Military historians still debate the overall tactical importance of the Stinger. Only 6 weapons existed within one regiment, so the effect on the entire battle was limited. However, those 6 weapons mattered greatly to the Marines who fought beside them. The heavy suppressive fire allowed advances that might otherwise have stopped. The intense firing rate of about 1,200 rounds per minute forced enemy soldiers to stay under cover during critical moments. What no historian debates is the courage shown by Tony Stein. 8 trips under enemy fire. 9 wounded Marines rescued. Barefoot runs through volcanic ash. A refusal to leave the battlefield even when wounded. A return from a hospital ship so he could rejoin his unit. And finally, leadership on a patrol that ended with his death. The barefoot corporal from Dayton represents an important part of the Marine Corps spirit. Improvise, adapt, overcome. When standard equipment fails, create something better. When wounded, continue the mission. When ordered to rest, return to the unit. When facing impossible odds, move forward. Tony Stein was 23 years old when he died. He had served as a Marine for 2 years and 5 months. He fought on 2 islands during the war. He killed more enemy soldiers than official records could measure. He saved 9 lives in one single day. And he accomplished all of this with a weapon he helped build inside a maintenance shed in Hawaii. If this story affected you the way it affected us, please press the like button. Every like tells YouTube to share this story with more viewers. Subscribe and turn on notifications as well. We bring forgotten stories out of old archives every day. These stories tell about toolmakers and Marines who saved lives with salvaged aircraft guns and courage shown without shoes on volcanic ground. Leave a comment and tell us where you are watching from. Are you watching in the United States? In the United Kingdom? In Canada or Australia? Our audience now reaches across the world. You are not only a viewer. You help keep these memories alive. Tell us your location. Tell us if someone in your family served. Let us know that you are here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for helping ensure that Tony Stein is not forgotten. These men deserve remembrance, and your attention helps make that possible.